Sorry, he wanted them to surrender. Yeah. Oh, we're on. Okay, sorry. We were having a conversation here. Okay, as we can tell it's getting toward the end of this class. Okay, last time we were talking about the fall of Toulouse. No, we're now talking about the fall of Toulouse. Okay, we've got Simon de Montfort making a direct attack on Toulouse, urged by the legate Arnaud Amaury. And Toulouse was a very large city for the Middle Ages, 25,000 people. It had ample water on the Garonne River, and the men of Toulouse remained loyal to Raymond. Whether they were Cathar or Catholic, they were on Raymond's side. And Raymond finally gave up negotiation and fought back. And so there was a huge battle at Toulouse. Almost all the lords of Western Aquitania rallied to Raymond's cause. Simon slipped away and tried to keep the enemy off balance. He ravaged the lands of the Count of Foix right up to the gates of his castle. He attacked Cahors and received the homage of the bishop, who claimed to be the Count of Quercy, who quickly did homage to the King of France on Simon's departure. The Counts of Foix and Comminges, the Vicomte of Béarn, the Seneschal of Aquitaine joined Raymond, and the mercenaries joined and were fairly reliable. But Simon's campaign himself, Simon was brilliant. He lost castle after castle, but was never beaten. And the Southerners, again, had this great flaw that they couldn't unify, they couldn't coordinate their efforts, even though Simon was just enormously outnumbered. And in spring 1212, the usual flow of crusaders from the north began. I mean, if you're going to serve your 40 days and nights, summer is a good time to do it. So when the spring came, the crusaders started, migrating for the south to get their duty in. And Simon, now he was building another army from these recruits, and he took the offensive. He began encircling Toulouse, and he took Agen, Moissac, Cahors, and Albi. And so he really set him out. This is the seal of Foix, of the Count of Foix. I had a picture of Foix, I guess I didn't put it in. And this is the seal of the Count of Comminges, the southern lord who was rallying around. And here we can see the areas in which he's conquering. Of course, Toulouse, he's attacking the area of Toulouse, and Foix is down here. And these are Cahors, and Albi is here. And can't read that other one. But this is the area that he was fighting in and recapturing all of those areas in southern France. And here is Moissac, the church at Moissac, which is really beautiful. One thing you can see about it is all of the Spanish and southern influence in the church at Moissac. These southern churches are very, very different from the northern churches. Here is the grand entrance to the church at Moissac, which is far different from the northern churches. It really is quite the styles in the south are different because it's a different culture, of course. The city of Muret completed the encirclement, and at this point we come to the triumph of Simon de Montfort. Pope Innocent III had other problems. He had a hostile German emperor, and King John then finally turned against him and seized the church in England. Saladin was in possession of Jerusalem. And this, actually he isn't. This is Joni, help me on this one. Saladin was not in possession of Jerusalem, but the Muslims were in possession of Jerusalem. And he had a campaign against the Moors going on in Spain. Fear of French domination was growing in Aquitania. Simon, as Vicomte of Béziers, could be tolerated, but Simon as Count of Toulouse was something else. Simon expected more service and greater obedience from his vassals than southern lords did of their vassals. And remember, the concept of feudalism in northern France was far different than in southern France, and it was much more rigorous and much more defined. And so the southerners were not used to this northern lord who demanded more of them, and they were used to a lot of independence in the south. Actually, Simon passed the Statutes of Pamiers in December 1212, and what it was an introduction of French feudal law. Again, the imposition of this northern law, including primogeniture, military service, and sub-infeudation. Do you all know what primogeniture is? Matthew?
Right of firstborn, correct?
Yeah, the firstborn inherits everything from his father. Okay, this was true in the north, but not in the south. In the south, the sons, and sometimes the daughters too, inherited all the property equally. It divided among them. In the north, the oldest son would inherit the property. Military service was required as part of being a feudal vassal, and this was true in the north and not in the south, because remember, the south had mostly allodial lands, which were not feudal lands. Allodial lands are lands they own themselves. And sub-infeudation, that is when you are, well, sub-infeudation is when a lord grants fiefs or manor houses to a vassal, and there are so many of them that that vassal then grants them to other vassals, and he becomes a lord of those sub-vassals. And so that's sub-infeudation. And that was not common in the south, and it was in the north. So all of these northern customs are now being imposed on the south, and the southerners don't like it. Here is, again, King John. Here's an interesting portrait of King John of England, and this is his money that he issued. It's quite different than the money that his father issued, which is interesting. It was the custom of Paris to determine all matters of feudal tenures, and this was introduced in the laws of Pamiers. To southerners, these statutes were both a threat and a provocation. Feudal law would obviously make Simon enormously strong, so the feudal lord under the northern laws was a lot stronger than it was customary in the south. It would make Simon immensely strong, and it would wipe out the local customs and impose alien laws on the southern culture. And in fact, what these northern laws would do would be to commit cultural genocide. I mean, the purpose of the northerners was to wipe out southern culture. And even the utterly Orthodox Catholics felt that Simon had gone too far. And so one of the things about the Albigensian Crusade is it is a conquest of northern France over southern France. It's not just a crusade against heresy. Peter of Aragon, chiefly Peter II of Aragon, wanted to stop the French expansion. Peter held Montpellier by marriage, and his brother and nephew were counts of Provence. His county of Catalonia shared Aquitanian culture, but Peter's lands were scattered and his vassals unreliable. Again, that's the same old story about the whole South. They're just not militarily organized. In April or May, Innocent asked the legates to give Raymond a chance to clear himself, and the legates actually refused. Okay, I wanted to show you where this is the land that the English hold here in Gascony, and this is the land that Barcelona that Raymond, that Peter of Aragon also has, that shares the culture of southern France. And this is Provence, again, to remind you where Provence is, and he held some lands in there. Okay, probably because he had launched the Spanish Crusade, it was hard for Peter to pay all of his attention to what was going on in France. Even Arnaud Amaury, now Archbishop of Narbonne, let troops go to Spain. The Spanish Crusade that Innocent led and that Peter of Aragon actually participated in was a brilliant success. In 16 July 1212, the Spanish Muslims were crushed in Los Navos de Tolosa, which was a major turning point of the conquest of Spain. And Peter II of Aragon was the hero of that combat. So Peter now was able, because he was a hero of the Spanish Crusade, he was able to go to Innocent and persuade him to end the Albigensian Crusade on 15 January 1213. And so, at that point, Innocent actually sent a letter chastising Simon. And here is poor Simon, the only hero of the Northerners, who's doing a really good job. And Innocent now chastises him. And so, but it was because Peter was forming alliances, and he formed the alliances with the lords threatened by Simon, and this horrified the papal legates because they wanted the heretics driven out, and Simon was their hero. So, I can only view Innocent here as duplicitous in going against what he started. But he must have been, I don't know, what do you think about that? Wasn't he in kind of a difficult position? What do you think about, what should Innocent have done here? What would you have done? Travis?
It seems morally he should have supported Simon as the person pursuing his desires for the Albigensian Crusade. And if this heretic still existed, he had, as the leader of the Catholic Church, the Western Church at the time, he had the obligation to pursue the heretics. So it seems like he's backing out.
But why? But he's doing it because Peter of Aragon, who is the great hero of the Spanish Crusade in the Battle of Los Navos de Tolosa, now comes and asks a favor of the Pope because he's been the hero of this great reconquest of the Muslims. What is Innocent to do in this situation? I mean, he owes something to Peter. Peter's a big hero, too.
He has to pick and choose.
Yeah.
He picks Peter.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because the Muslims are perceived as the greater enemy because they're much more foreign than the southern French, the
Cathars. Yeah. Do you all agree? Anybody? How about you, Gary? Comments on that?
He probably should have just tolerated the heretics and tried to make peace.
Maybe he should have tolerated the heretics and tried to make peace?
Right. Instead of killing them all, just sort of take them out of control and make peace among Simon and Peter in the church.
Yeah, or maybe he should have tried to make peace between Simon and Peter, which is, I think, the point you're making, that somehow he should have reconciled these people. But Peter, I mean, I don't think Peter especially liked the heretics necessarily. I mean, he was a good Catholic. But these people were his allies. I mean, everything is so mixed up. It's not really clear. I mean, these heretics, the lords would do lip service to the Catholic Church. And so they would sort of pretend to be loyal to the Catholic Church, and yet they tolerated all the heretics. But if they didn't tolerate the heretics, what are they going to do? Kill all the people in their cities? I mean, they're really in a fix here as to what they're going to do. Yeah, Travis.
I'm just kind of surprised the church didn't tax the heresies.
Well, now, if they had been Muslims, they would have taxed them. That's a good idea. Innocent didn't think of that, did he? Instead, he taxed the Crusaders who went on crusade. Maybe Innocent wasn't as great a pope as we think he was. Okay. Well, Peter, meanwhile, had been forming alliances with all his friends who were ruling the southern cities, with the lords threatened by Simon, and this horrified the papal legates. So the papal legates held a council at Lavar, and they declared that Raymond was not to be trusted, that Simon was the only man who could save the church, and all of the papal legates wrote letters to Innocent III. So they came to the defense of Simon, as well they should, because he was carrying out their cause. And so in May, now this shows the dilemma of Innocent, he reversed himself completely. And Peter was scolded for interfering, and the crusade against the heretics was restored. But Innocent had weakened Simon, and fewer recruits came from the north because Innocent had not held firm, and so this sort of, lessened the fervor of the northern lords who weren't sure what was going on. And meanwhile, the Gascons and the Aragonese were joining Raymond's forces against Simon. Now, the Gascons were from that area that England ruled, that area to the west where England ruled. Simon concentrated his defense at Muret, and Peter hoped to trap him there. In a pitched battle, outnumbered 2-1, Simon swept aside the opposition, and Peter was killed in that battle. The Toulousan infantry was cut down or drowned in the Garonne River, and Raymond VI and his son escaped to renew the battle 5 years later, but Innocent still vacillated, and the city of Narbonne resisted him. Its Archbishop Arnaud Amaury defended his rights as ecclesiastical prince. So Narbonne was ruled by a bishop as the Lord of Narbonne. This is something really different in the south. They're not following the same rules as the north. Okay, here is Muret, where this major battle took place right there, and these are the lords of the Garonne in here, who are now, of course, just across the Pyrenees is Aragon. And so they're all joining together against Muret, and the lords of Narbonne. Narbonne, of course, is ruled by the bishops, and they also held out. Montpellier refused to admit Simon. Thus, he was excluded from the 3 largest cities of Occitania. Simon made the mistake of trying to take over Raymond's rights as Marquis of Provence. Provence was a part of the empire. Remember that the German king held the authority over Provence, and there was no crusade there. The crusade was not taking place in Provence. Do you all remember where Provence was? Okay, let's go back to this map for just a minute. It was to the east was Provence. This is Provence. Here's the Rhone River, and all of this area to the east is Provence, and it is ruled by the Emperor of Germany, is the overlord there. So Simon really didn't have any part in that, and the crusade wasn't going on. The rebellion that was to destroy Simon began in Provence, in the area he had no control over. Raymond's younger brother Baldwin, raised in the court of the King of France, had served Simon, turning against his brother, and probably he hoped to have a good claim to the county. The Aragonese and the Count of Foix wanted satisfaction for Raymond's defeat at Muret, and Baldwin, the brother of Raymond, was condemned as a traitor and hanged. Okay, now what is the King of France going to do about that when the man raised at his court is arbitrarily hanged by the enemy? Both Innocent III and Philip Augustus hesitated to give full authority to Simon. They saw him as too ambitious and dangerously able. He was just too talented for them to give him a lot of power. So they were worried about what Simon was going to do. And here is Montpellier, again, just between Provence and the territories of Toulouse that he was trying to conquer. Both Philip Augustus and Innocent III were too busy with the Lateran Council of 1215 and the campaign against John of England, who is the enemy to both Philip Augustus and Innocent III. The papal legate Peter of Benevento was left to make interim decisions, and Peter of Benevento confirmed all of Simon's conquest, but refused to give him the title of Count of Toulouse, which would have ratified his rule there. Raymond VI, the Counts of Foix and Comminges, the burgesses of Toulouse, threw themselves on the mercy of the church, and Raymond at this point transferred all his rights to his son and ceded all his lands to the church. Sorry, I've got a typo there. Peter hoped to build up an ecclesiastical state to balance the power of Simon. Okay, yeah, question.
Who is hoping to build an ecclesiastical state?
The papal legate Peter of Benevento. Okay, This is not Peter of Aragon. I'm glad you clarified that. Too many Peters here. Okay, so Peter, everybody was worried that Simon was getting too powerful. And so the way to cure this is to counterbalance it with a papal state right there. And Peter of Benevento was trying to build a papal state. But a new group of southern bishops, fervent opponents of heresy, vehemently opposed the limitations on Simon's power. They really they wanted Simon to have that power. They wanted a strong man. They saw Simon as the one man who could wipe out the church's enemies. These bishops sent a delegation to Rome asking Innocent III to make Simon the sole ruler of Toulouse. And Innocent granted Simon de facto administration rights. Okay, what's wrong with this picture? If Innocent III made Simon Count of Toulouse, whose rights is he abrogating?
He's playing Simon against people of his own administration.
Yeah, but who claims to be overlord of Toulouse? Travis?
Are you talking about Raymond, or are you talking about Philip Augustus?
I'm suggesting Philip Augustus, as King of France, would have claimed overlordship. And my guess is he would have been horrified to imagine that Innocent III would be the one to grant that lordship. What does it mean if Innocent is able to grant that lordship? What is he sort of conferring on himself? Yeah, Matthew.
He really is starting to become the ruler of all the world at this point.
Yes, if he is able to confer the lordship of Toulouse, it's as if he's stepping in there and saying, I'm going to be the ruler of southern France, because Toulouse is the main county over all the rest of the counties of southern France. And so it's like he had offered Philip Augustus the chance to conquer southern France, and Philip had really, not led that and not sponsored it, although he let his barons go. But now Innocent is claiming he is the Lord by this act of appointing Simon. Okay, so Innocent then granted Simon de facto administrative rights. Philip Augustus had just won a double victory, however. Philip Augustus had defeated Otto IV of Germany at the Battle of Bouvines, which was a big, important battle. And his son, who was Louis VIII, had pushed back the army of John of England. So he had just defeated two major enemies, the Emperor of Germany and the King of England. And he wanted to remind Simon, the legate, and the Pope that Toulouse was a fief of France. Okay, here now Philip Augustus is going to strike back because he sees Innocent sort of claiming the overlordship of Toulouse. And so it was at this point that Philip Augustus allowed his son Louis to go south to the crusade. So now Prince Louis, who is going to later be Louis VIII, heads south to head the crusade, and this stakes the claim of the King of France over the territory of southern France. And Louis then openly intervened on Simon's behalf, and now he is staking his claim to be overlord. And he made Arnaud, Amaury, and the Narbonnese swear allegiance to Simon. So he did something that Pope Innocent really couldn't do. He went there in person and said, I'm the overlord here. Okay, and he ordered Toulouse to destroy its walls and fill its moats and accept Simon as the Count of Toulouse. And so the King of France is firmly putting himself there. I'm sorry, this is Louis the VII. I meant to put Louis VIII here. No, it's Louis VIII who is the one who did this. Yeah, Louis VIII headed south. I might have a picture of Louis Louis VIII. Let me see if I... Here's a picture of Otto IV, who has just been defeated by Philip Augustus. Okay, this is a sort of self-portrait of Otto IV, the emperor. and ruling as a Christian king with that cross on the back of it. And here is another coin that he has showing him as a mounted warrior. Okay, let's see, do I have Louis the Eighth? I have Louis the Eighth. Nope, I don't have Louis the Eighth. But here is Raymond the Sixth. Here is Raymond the Sixth. Remember that he went on crusade at one point, and so there he is dressed as a crusader, which I'm sure is publicity for what he's doing. Okay. And here is a wonderful picture of the landscape, Brunet Quill, of what this landscape is like in this area of southern France. Impregnable castles on mountaintops. Okay, so this is where they're fighting their battles. All right, so Raymond now took refuge in England, and Simon was now the lord from the Agenais to Rhone, from Quercy to the Pyrenees. In other words, Simon had all of southern France, but he didn't have Provence. Remember that Provence was separate. The Fourth Lateran Council was held on November 1215, and at the Fourth Lateran Council, all the lands, conquered lands, were granted to Simon. Now we have this rivalry. The papacy is again claiming its rights to grant all the lands, after the King of France has granted all the lands. The church provision was now to give Raymond a pension and the lands in Provence. Simon was now Count of Toulouse for sure. He'd been granted by both king and pope the lands in Toulouse, so he surely was the Count of Toulouse. He was also named the Duke of Narbonne and the Vicomte of Béziers and Carcassonne. And interestingly, what he did was hasten to Paris and do homage to Philip Augustus in April 1216, which is what we would expect him to do, because Innocent had tried to torpedo him earlier, so clearly his loyalty was with the King of France. Philip confirmed him and recognized all his titles. Okay, I've got another typo, sorry. Okay, now the Aquitanians then were inspired to counterattack. What happened was that all these armies that went to the south were transient. Very few people stayed and settled and colonized the south. And so very few Frenchmen had actually lived and settled in the south. The situation was kind of like it was in the Holy Land, where there weren't that many settlers. And so here are the lands that he ruled. He was Count of Toulouse, he was Duke of Narbonne, Vicomte of Béziers, and Carcassonne. So these are all the lands, but he ruled this whole territory in here, I mean all of southern France. Simon's southern vassals could not be entirely trusted because they were covertly hostile. Simon was a good general and not a good ruler. He was great at the military stuff, but he didn't know how to run a political county. He didn't know how to win over people. Meanwhile, Innocent III died in July of 1216, and his successor, Honorius III, preferred negotiations to war. Many of the southern churchmen quarreled with Simon, and the French back in France were less interested in the south, because their attention was turned to England. Their eyes were on England because Magna Carta had been signed, and the barons rebelled and had seized all of the lands of had seized all of England, and the barons' rebellion had opened up interesting possibilities. The French now hoped to gain Poitou, which was part of the hereditary lands that John had gotten through his mother Eleanor. Okay, Louis VIII was urged to claim the throne of England himself, and he then invaded England because John had been deposed. There was no king in England. At this point, Honorius excommunicated Louis, who did penance in 1217. Raymond V and Raymond VI and Raymond VII landed at Marseille in April 1216. Now Marseille was an independent city-state, and they greeted Raymond with joy, as did Provence. So Provence was going to serve as a launching pad for the rebellion in the south. In less than a month, a large army gathered at Avignon under Raymond VII. Raymond VI went to Aragon to seek help, and the opportunity came in May. Beaucaire put itself under their lordship. Simon, his brother Guy, and his son Amaury rushed to support the French garrison in Citadel. A double siege began. Raymond VII attacked the garrison in the Citadel, and Simon cut off Beaucaire. Simon made 3 unsuccessful attacks on the town, and on 24 August he gave up. He lifted the siege in return for a safe exit of the troops in the Citadel. And here are the towns we're talking about. Here is Beaucaire, and here is Avignon, and the independent port of Marseille, where Raymond and his father, Raymond the Sixth and Raymond VII, landed. And here's the center of the rebellion, and Beaucaire, of course, is over in this territory. And here is a picture of Raymond VII of Toulouse, showing him in a more, not in a warlike stance, but in a governing stance, which is kind of interesting. Okay. And here is Beaucaire, the city that they're attacking in the eastern part of Occitania. The loss of Beaucaire was a disaster in terms of morale. The Occitanians had won at last, and the legend of Simon's invincibility was shattered. The troubadours mocked Simon. That meant they wrote humorous poems against him, making fun of him, and they began to weave new plots. Toulouse was restless, and Simon punished the whole town, but then riots broke out and turned into rebellion. Simon's soldiers were driven from the streets to the cathedral, and the bishop and abbot of St. Sernin acted as peacemakers. The cathedral was, of course, St. Sernin Toulouse, which was the big cathedral of the city. Simon agreed to pardon Toulouse in exchange for 30,000 marks, but Toulouse then became only more hostile. By ceaseless campaigning, Simon held his own for a year, and in 1217 he crossed the Rhone to punish the lords of Provence. Toulouse's leading citizens offered to surrender the city to Raymond VI if he would just bring troops to defend it. And here is the Cathedral of St. Sernin Toulouse, which is one of the most famous Romanesque cathedrals in southern France, a huge cathedral. Raymond crossed the Pyrenees and was joined by the Counts of Foix and Comminges. The army entered Toulouse on the 13th of September, 1217, and was welcomed enthusiastically. The French garrison took refuge in the Chateau Narbonnais, the castle of Narbonne, and all the leading citizens worked feverishly to build a line of fortifications around the city. Simon was informed of the rebellion by his wife, and so he left Provence and hurried to Toulouse. But his attack was repulsed. October worked against him because, he had no reinforcements coming from France. Everybody was staying home for the winter. There was bad weather, and there were no new crusaders. But in spring 1218, both sides received reinforcement, and Simon's attack was repulsed. Simon constructed a huge cat, a rolling wooden tower, and the Toulousans fought back by hurling stones from machines manned by women. Even the women came out and got those hurling machines that hurled the stones over the wall. Here's the construction of the wall as they're building it up. A stone struck Simon on the head, crushed his skull, and he died instantly. So he was killed by the women of Narbonne. And here is Simon de Montfort, again shown as this courageous warrior on his seal. And this is interestingly, it says commune of the city. And so this must be a coin that he issued from Toulouse as a commune or a city. The political victory that established French rule on a firm basis was to be won by Louis VIII and Louis IX of France, not by the Montforts, because Amaury, the son of Simon, was not a good general, and immediately defections began. Amaury appealed to Paris, and Louis VIII set out in May 1219 through Poitou and joined Amaury at Marmande near Bordeaux. Marmande was captured and the town was massacred. Again, they're using terror tactics. They massacre the whole town so that all the others will surrender. Next, Louis laid siege to Toulouse, and then he failed. But everyone now deserted Amaury. He had no money, and town after town slipped away. Guy de Montfort, the brother of Simon, was killed. And here's the death of Simon de Montfort. It shows the whole thing. And this is an interesting one. It shows the men attacking, and where are the women who are hurling the stones? Okay. Top are the women. Here? Can't see where the women are. This looks like the machine to hurl the stones. Anyway, this shows the death of Simon de Montfort. I wonder why all these people are naked underneath. If they're in a mine, these must be the soldiers that are attacking. Okay, and here is the progress that the army takes. Here is Poitou, and it goes down to Bordeaux, and then heads this way to Toulouse to attack the city. By 1222, Raymond VII had regained everything his father had lost, and Raymond VI died. The church denied him the last sacraments and burial in consecrated ground. And in 1223, the very next year, Raymond Roger of Foix died, and his heir, Roger Bernard, was a capable, loyal supporter of Raymond VII. Amaury's cause now was lost. He abandoned the south to Raymond VII in an honorable exit. And Raymond VII occupied Carcassonne and Béziers without resistance. He gave them at once as fiefs to Raymond Trinqueval, son of Raymond Roger, who had died in Simon's prison 15 years earlier. The dispossessed were back in power, and the heretics were also back in their old places. So it looked like everything had been reversed for the moment. And here is the money of Raymond Roger, the Vicomte of Béziers, who had died in Simon's prison. Okay, now his son was back in control of his fiefs. Now the king set out on crusade, and it was Louis VIII who was going to save the day for the French. And the Southerners were at this point out of luck. Honorius II concluded, this is the Pope, Honorius II concluded that only a crusade or its threat would force Raymond VII and his allies into making a serious effort to eradicate heresy. In 1223, though, Philip Augustus died, and in 1224, this should be Louis VIII, was concerned with securing Poitou from English influence. But its borders and dependencies of Poitou ran into Aquitania, and Louis VIII was open to crusade, and now he's King of France. He demanded stiff conditions from the Pope in order to go on crusade. The church was to meet most of his expenses. He was free to come and go as he chose, and he could annex any lands he overran. Okay, this would solve the problem of who was going to grant these fiefs, the Pope or the King of France. And so the deal Louis VIII made with the Pope was he would be the undisputed overlord. Okay, Honorius II wasn't going to do what Innocent did. And here is the seal of Louis VIII. I knew I had Louis VIII somewhere in here. So here's a picture of Louis VIII as a very Roman ruler and king. In short, if he could get Toulouse, Carcassonne, and Béziers quickly and cheaply, Louis would. He would not spend half his life there, as had Simon. Honorius would have preferred to install a prince loyal to Rome in southern France, as he tried to make Simon. He would have preferred to send Louis to Jerusalem on crusade, and at first he refused to accept Louis's proposal. He wanted him to just frighten Raymond into obedience to Rome. And Louis, at this point, was infuriated. He saw this power play the papacy was making, but his forces in Poitou did, in fact, terrify Raymond. And at this point, Raymond tried to make peace with the Pope. He promised to punish and expel the heretics, to redress the wrongs to the southern churches, and to pay a large sum of money to Amaury de Montfort. Okay? And he tried rather half-heartedly and failed, though, because the local bishops were against him. A papal legate renewed Raymond's excommunication and also excommunicated his vassals. Amaury de Montfort ceded his claims to the king. Amaury de Montfort was rather weak and incompetent, a member of that family. Okay, the papal legate then confirmed the king's right to all of Raymond's lands, asking the king to lead the crusades. So Louis was quite astute in handling this crisis. He got what he wanted. The barons supported the request, and the king took the cross on January 30th, 1226. All his 1224 conditions were now met. In May 1226, the army assembled at Bourges, the largest force ever assembled against the south, and its size terrified the southerners. As it advanced down the Rhone, more and more southerners submitted. Béziers, Carcassonne, Nîmes, Beaucaire, Marseille, and so here they are traveling down the Rhone River, and so they convened at Bourges. Let's see, I didn't mark Bourges on this map. Bourges is north of here, and so, yeah, it's closer, it's north of Paris. And so they went down the Rhone River, and here they are, Nîmes, Beaucaire, Marseille, Béziers, and Carcassonne. So everything is falling to the king's huge and terrifying army. Toulouse alone did not panic, and a few smaller places followed its leads, including Agen and the Count of Foix. Avignon itself was virtually an independent republic and owed its allegiance to the emperor, but the emperor had almost no authority in Provence. In Provence, in fact, Avignon resembled Bologna rather than Paris or Toulouse. It was more like a northern city, a city in northern Italy, rather than being like a French city. As the king's army approached, the Avignonese hit on a device of building a temporary wooden bridge over the Rhone outside the town. And Louis, worried about his prestige, demanded to cross on the Great Stone Bridge. What they did was build this just, little jury-rigged temporary little bridge, a little nothing bridge, and told the king, okay, that's where you can cross the river. And Louis, being a king, said, I want to cross on the Great Stone Bridge. And so he did not want to fight, but the bourgeoisie would not let him cross on the main bridge. And to give you an idea of what that bridge looked like, this is the Petit Pont de Paris, and so bridges were more than just a bridge. I mean, here you can see the bridge across the river with the river flowing, but they had walls and they had buildings and everything on it. A stone bridge was a great edifice, and so jury-rigging a little wooden bridge was not to the king's liking. Okay. So on 10 June 1226, the siege of Avignon began, and it was almost an accident, as we saw. The walls were very strong, but the huge army could cut off all the approaches. And here is Avignon, where the siege is taking place. The city experienced some shortages of food, but the Crusaders also ran short. The lack of sanitation, disease, and summer heat took their toll on all the Crusaders, and even the king fell ill. The Count of Champagne went home, and all of the men were discontented. But now Louis launched a full-scale assault in August, and it was a failure. But the town eventually surrendered and paid an indemnity of 6,000 marks and destroyed its walls and gave hostages. The fall of Avignon established French rule permanently in the south, and now Aquitania was even more terrified. Provence was surrounded. Louis marched south, leaving garrisons and some rudimentary administration as he went along. And when he did this, of course, leaving rudimentary administration was he left commanders of the cities, and he left some bureaucrats there, a staff to take control. And so this reduced the size of the army as he progressed through the countryside, leaving people to govern each of the cities, which was a very smart move on his part. But the army was reduced, already weakened by losses suffered at Avignon. He drew near Toulouse in mid-October, but decided to return home already ill, and Louis himself, from the illness that he suffered outside of Avignon, died on 8 November 1226. Okay. Raymond continued the war for 2 more years. Blanche of Castile now was left as the regent of France, and she was an incredible woman, actually. Louis IX was still a child, and so she was the regent, and she was the regent for a good 10 years. She faced conspiracies of the barons and rebellions, and she really had to hold on by her fingernails. But somebody needs to do a biography of her. I mean, she's quite a remarkable woman in that she held everything together, and she was a wonderful mother to Louis IX, who became St. Louis. And we're going to talk about St. Louis next week. She maintained a garrison in the south strong enough to check Raymond, and all this time she was fighting off these major barons of France who were trying to get control of her and her son, to wrest the regency away from her, and to really shape the policy of France against her will and against the interests of her son Louis IX. And even so, she managed to hold on to the south while she was confronting all of those things. At a conference at Meaux in December 1228 to 1229, she finally worked out an agreement. Raymond was reconciled with the church and recognized as Count of Toulouse, but he had to do a public act of penance. He had to promise to hunt out heretics and punish them. And here is a picture of Blanche of Castile. Here she is later on. She was a regent for her son, and here is her son, Louis IX, who later became St. Louis, and he actually carried out 2 crusades. He was probably the greatest king that France had in the Middle Ages. I don't know, we have to vote on whether he or Philip Augustus was the best. But certainly his reputation and the feeling that the French had for him was that he was the best king, and a lot of it was due to the supporting work of his mother and the way that his mother raised him. And so here is St. Louis as Blanche had raised him. Okay, wait, I lost my train of thought there. Okay. Raymond had to do a public act of penance, and he had to promise to hunt out heretics and punish them. And he offered 2 marks to anyone who captured one. He had to pay the church 14,000 marks, and he had to pay 4,000 marks for salaries of professors of theology, canon law, and the arts who were to come to Toulouse to establish orthodoxy. And in fact, this is the beginning of the foundation of the University of Toulouse. And by this time, universities were strong in the north of France. The university tradition had been set up. It had been about 200 years that universities had been growing in the north. They start to grow about 1200, maybe about 100 years. And so now this founds the University of Toulouse. And he also sets up a actually, it's Blanche of Castile who sets up this plan. Raymond's daughter Jean was to marry the king's brother Alphonse and to be his sole heir. So he is leaving the kingdom to his daughter Jean, who is married to the brother of King Louis, and they're all children, of course. And so this means that the lands will pass by inheritance into the French domain. And again, it's this very clever use of the of marriage alliances in order to bring the dominions into the king's realm. Toulouse, with the Agenais, Rouergue, and parts of the Albigeois and Quercy, were to revert to their children or the crown on Raymond's death. Okay, so the children of Jean and Alphonse would then inherit Toulouse and all of the area of the Albigeois and all of that area in the south. And so the lands would pass peacefully without any battles to the children of the two enemies, who now settle everything with a marriage alliance. This treaty was ratified at Paris on 12 April 1229, and it consolidated the Capetian position in the south. The towns and the barons could not resist the royal power, and so there were few uprisings. Even the church lost some of its autonomy. And here is the interior of a school that shows, this is actually this is a university. This is how they taught in the university with the professor. What he's actually doing is reading this book to these students who are copying it down as he dictates the book to them. So maybe we're following in that tradition here, only you got yours printed out. Okay, so the fiefs the Montforts held of the bishops and abbots were now merged into the royal domain, and the Montforts really established their interest in England. Only the heretics were willing to risk violence. In 1242, there was Raymond rebelled. There was a rebellion, and there was a massacre of the inquisitors at Avignonet, south of Toulouse, by the heretics from Montségur. Raymond's vassals then deserted him, and Raymond submitted to the crown. In March 1243 to March 1244, we have the siege of the very last stronghold of the heretics in Montségur, an impenetrable fortress. Finally it surrendered, but 200 perfecti joyfully entered the flames rather than recant. Okay, so 200 of the perfecti were burned at the stake. The fall of Montségur also weakened the structure of the Cathar church because it was deprived of its only headquarters at this point, and the church never recovered. Meanwhile, the Inquisition was left to take care of all the heretics there. Now this Inquisition set up in France, it was actually Innocent III who set the Dominicans there and set the Inquisition in motion. It was not as horrible as the Spanish Inquisition was later on, but it's the origin of the Spanish Inquisition. But they tried not to kill people. They didn't want to kill people and lose their souls. They tried very hard to convert people, the heretics, and convert them back to Christianity because they didn't want to lose them. But the Inquisition, with all those Dominican friars spread out through all of southern France, tracking people down, getting people to betray their neighbors, and herding the heretics in to be questioned and to be persuaded to convert, that was the real triumph in the end. Okay, and this is a Roquemadour, which is like Montségur. I didn't have a picture of Montségur, but I mean, you look at this hillside with the castle on the top. I mean, this is incredible fortress that finally fell to the French. Here's another picture of Roquemadour, and Montségur was quite similar to this. These are the kinds of strongholds the heretics stayed in, the Cathars stayed in when they escaped the cities. The cities were no longer safe places. The Dominicans marshaled the order of preachers, and they had extraordinary powers to discover and investigate cases of heresy. This was an organization that was totally separate from the bishops. The bishops had no control and no say in the Inquisition organization. It was only the Dominican friars. Mere suspicion carried a presumption of guilt, and the accused could only clear themselves by confession and revealing more names. The penalties, the penalties were giving alms and making one or two short pilgrimages. But hard cases were often imprisoned for life, and people had to forfeit all their property. And if they relapsed into heresy, it was only then that they were killed and they were burned at the stake. Raymond had no more children, and Jean and Alphonse were childless, so eventually Toulouse reverted to the crown. And this then was, in fact, the end of the Albigensian Crusade. Okay, and meanwhile, we then have St. Louis, who is now eventually on the throne. And let me show you some Albigensians. Here we have some Albigensians in the midst of the Inquisition being imprisoned. And this is, of course, is an imaginative 19th century drawing. It's not a real drawing. The others I'm showing you are real drawings of artifacts of the time. And here is St. Louis, who then, he's on the right here as the king. And these are his sergeants at arms, some of his courtiers. And obviously when he grew up, he became a very great king of France, and continuing in the tradition of his father. If his father had lived longer, he might have been a very great king as well. Okay, so we have a few minutes left over to have a discussion of any of these points that you'd like to talk about. In your reading, the Song of the Cathar Wars, or any of the points we've raised today. Yeah, Matthew.
Dr. Vaughn?
Oh, yes, Gary. Okay, we'll let Gary go first.
Thank you. Two lengthy questions. What was the basis for their heresy? A misinterpretation of the Latin text of the Bible? And I'll wait for the second question.
Okay, good, because I won't remember both of them. What was the source of this heresy? It was a heresy that started in the Roman Empire. In about the 2nd century is when it was really big. It was called the Christian Gnostic heresy. It was dualistic, and most of the beliefs they had were pretty similar to the ones that appeared in France at this time. The heretics, the Gnostics, were kind of stamped out by the Orthodox group in Christianity. But then remember that when you say the Orthodox Christians in the Roman Empire, there were lots of competing groups of Christians, and they all thought they were Orthodox. And the question is, which group is going to win, to become the Orthodox group and put their will on the others. And it was the group that did become, that we now call Orthodox. And so the Gnostics then withdrew, and where they were living was in the area around, I'm trying to remember, it's sort of north, it's in the Byzantine state, it's in Armenia. It's kind of right next to Armenia, between Armenia and Hungary. In that basic area is where they kind of hold up, and they remained there for just, centuries and centuries. And then they started to get a little stronger, and they maintained the same beliefs and developed them that they had in the Roman Empire, and they had been isolated all that time. But one thing you might remember about the Holy Land, all those different groups of Christians that were there. Remember, there are about 7 different kinds of Christians in the Holy Land. who had survived from Roman times, and they're all either schismatic or they're schismatic mostly. But this group, the Gnostics, were really heretical. I mean, don't you think their beliefs are pretty heretical? Do you think they are, Gary?
Well, clearly, and my question also leads me to wonder what they were using to justify their beliefs. That's why I was wondering if it was a misinterpretation of the Latin Bible, and also
Okay.
were they teaching these in the Catholic Church, or did they have their own churches?
Well, they had their own churches, obviously. None of these things were taught. Actually, there was a discovery of several jars full of manuscripts at Nag Hammadi in the Holy Land. It's somewhere in the desert in the Holy Land, and they found a lot of the Gnostic scriptures that somebody had hidden in a cave to preserve them. Apparently their enemies were attacking them, and this is, I mean, there's lots of information about it. You can get books. There's a whole book that is a translation of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, which are all Gnostic Gospels. There is a book called The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine, what is her name, Joni? Pagels, Elaine Pagels, yeah, and it is, let me write it down for you here, because it's extremely interesting. She argues that it's a feminist movement. And the reason she argues that is because remember that Judas committed suicide, and so then there were only 11 disciples, so they had to get another disciple. Well, the Gnostics got Mary Magdalene as that substitute disciple, and there is a gospel according to Mary Magdalene among these Gnostic gospels. And they allowed women to be priests and to be bishops, and they allowed women to vote in their meetings, and they didn't have a set hierarchy where you appoint a bishop for life and a priest for life, but rather every time they came together in a meeting, they elected who was going to be the priest or the bishop for that day or that meeting. And so they were very democratic, when there are very democratic elements of Christianity. So to answer that question of yours, they were interpreting Jesus' teaching somewhat differently. But then you have to remember that the four Gospels, which contain the life of Jesus and his teachings, were not pulled together until almost 100 years after Jesus died. And there were other competing Gospels around that the church rejected. There's a Gospel of Peter, there's a Gospel of Thomas, there are several other Gospels. There are stories of Jesus' childhood that somebody just made up because we actually don't know anything about his childhood, and this Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And so, you know, the church fathers, the Orthodox fathers, had all those different Gospels to choose from, and the Gnostics had their own Gospels. And if you read, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, they sort of follow the same lines that the Gnostics do. I mean, the Orthodox Church chose its Gospels very carefully. And one of the things they emphasized was the humanity of Christ. And we all think the Renaissance was so wonderful because of the humanitas, or the humanitarian, it's not humanitarianism, the humanitas is humanism. And we think that's all wonderful. Well, you know, it comes out of this decision by the early church to preserve Jesus as 50% human and 50% divine. The fact that Jesus is fully human and fully divine means the humane doctrines that humans are valued, they're made in God's image, they're perfectible. All of these humanistic ideas come from that decision in the church. And then, of course, it's reinforced at the time in the 12th century when they start showing Jesus dead on the cross, and we have this image of the humanness of Jesus being emphasized very strongly. And I don't think that has anything to do with this Cathar heresy, because it was being done before this heresy appeared. That the humanness of Jesus was being stressed. Okay, does that kind of answer your question? I mean, it's really long and involved. Elaine Pagel's book is the Gnostic Gospels, and it's a nice short book. She kind of jumped the gun and wrote her book before the others finished their research. But there's a whole book called the Nag Hammadi Manuscripts. And they've all been translated and published in paperback, so you can get these manuscripts and you can read them. Okay. Did I answer your question, Gary? Any or raise new ones?
Yes, ma'am. And I guess I was wondering, because when a crusade is called to kill these people or to stop the heresy, I was trying to get a picture in my mind if they were churches cropping up among the Catholic churches, or if they were actually teaching it from the Catholic churches.
That's a good question. As far as I can figure out, the Catholic churches and the Cathar churches existed side by side in these cities, but I don't believe the Cathars had buildings, because they didn't believe in buildings. They didn't believe in material things. And so they tended to just meet together, although they hung out in the cities. But then when they discovered that the Crusaders were coming and attacking them in the cities, they then left and hid out in these castles, perched high on rocky cliffs. And that's why we see them at Montségur at the end, in that kind of a castle where they were hiding once the crusade got really going. Okay, but again, they deny the value of the material world. And so Travis was raising a question at the break. He was suggesting that since the perfecti didn't marry, and they denied, they didn't want children, and they condemned sex and all of that, why not just let them die out of failing to reproduce themselves? But that would work, except that only the very well-disciplined could become perfecti, and they were only like 10% of the Cathars were perfecti, and most of the Cathars were, in fact, credentes, who were then on their path to perfection. But when they're on their path to perfection, they could slip and have sex and get married and all of those things. And so they were reproducing themselves. They weren't going to die out. And also they were converting people.
But would they get married in a Catholic church?
Oh, okay. Well, that raises another question. That's a good question. All right. The sacrament of marriage was not really set in the church until really the 12th century. And so there was a whole formal thing where they would go through a betrothal, which was almost as important as the marriage. And it really got to be the 13th and 14th century before marriages took place in the church. It was like before the 12th century, marriage was not a rite that took place in the church. It was done privately. And the church gradually took over the jurisdiction and the power to ratify these marriages and bless them, and gradually assumed the power of declaring whether someone was married or not. Because before the Reform movement in the church, that was one of the things the Reform movement wanted to do. But they didn't stress it a lot. They did it in a kind of stealth way. But eventually they did have the power to say when someone was married, and more importantly, when someone was not married. And this would be when they wanted to declare a marriage null and void because they were too closely related. And so they sort of gradually established their power as the court where those judgments were made, when a marriage was ratified and when it was broken up, annulled. Divorce was not allowed. But the only reason you could annul a marriage was if they were related too closely by blood. Okay, other questions? Any more questions?
You had asked us, I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, if we thought that the Crusades were coming to their golden age, or if they were receiving their death knell.
Okay. Yeah.
You put it in a little bit more elegant terms, but especially based upon what we read here in the Albigensian Crusade, in the Song of the Cathar Wars, it seems to me that the original idea of crusading, the idea set by Urban II, it really is beginning. It is beginning to die if it already hasn't done so.
Well, doesn't it kind of depend on how you're going to define crusade? Yeah. Anybody have any ideas about how we're going to define crusade, Travis?
Well, I just wanted to say the motives have changed, but the machinery is the same.
Good.
So that's, I would say that the Crusades can be defined as the machinery, so they really are fully developed now.
Okay, so that one could view them as reaching a point where they're now fully developed and elaborated if you define them by the machinery of going on crusade. If you define them by motives, then maybe you could say they're reaching a point of decline or decay, or what do you want to call it? Corruption? What do you think? What do you think about that, Matthew?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that idea. Travis seems to think of the crusade more as a function of machinery, while I see it more as a function of motive.
Okay, Gary, did you have a comment on that? Did I hear your mic click?
Well, was a crusade ever called that wasn't called by a pope?
Was there a crusade ever called that wasn't called by a pope?
The Americas?
Okay, if we call the conquest of the Americas a crusade, that was not called by a pope, so maybe it's not a crusade. Oh, it depends on how you define crusade, yeah.
But I think the Americas being conquered in that way, are you talking about the Spanish?
Yeah.
Okay, that was actually part of the Spanish Inquisition, and that was called by a pope.
Oh, no, how is it? How is it part of the Spanish Inquisition?
Well, the Spanish Inquisition...
Press your mic.
Okay, the Spanish Inquisition was brought about by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, right? After that, it was a continuing force in the Americas, because the Americas were discovered at the same time.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Certainly the Inquisition as an institution
was
carried from Spain. The Inquisition moves from France to Spain, and it moves to the Americas.
And that original institution was called upon by several popes.
By Innocent, yeah, that was called by a pope. The conquest of the Americas was not initiated by a pope, but the division of the Americas between the Portuguese and the Spanish was ruled by the Pope. Certainly the treatment of the Indians, I mean, because there were lots of friars, Dominican friars, going over with the conquistadores, but the idea of conquering was carried out by Cortez and Pizarro. There was somebody else who conquered Guatemala, and I can't remember who that is right now, but...
Dr. Vaughn, I brought that point up because I would say a definition begins with understanding the papacy and what they were trying to accomplish.
Okay, yeah, I think if we understand the papacy, but then only the numbered crusades were called by popes, because there were bunches of other crusades. The Children's Crusade, for example, was not called by a pope, it was spontaneous. The Crusade of 1100, which doesn't have a number, 1100, 1101, was a spontaneous movement. Again, there are constant spontaneous crusades to the Holy Land that we don't give numbers or names to, and those were not called by popes. So does that answer your question? Yeah, Matthew has a comment on that.
If they weren't called by the Pope, are they crusades?
It depends on how you define crusade, okay? So obviously when you write your papers and your exams, your definition of what a crusade is and what a crusading movement is absolutely crucial that you define these terms. Okay. Yeah.
It seems to be getting very circular. Between what's a crusade, it's this, it's that, what's a crusade. Just
Yeah, but these historians who write have done the very same thing. I mean, like what's his name?
Tyerman.
Jonathan Riley Moore, and who?
Tyerman, that invention of the
Tyerman.
crusades, he did a big circle.
He did. Tyerman did a big circle, and really his argument is based on a different definition than Jonathan Riley Smith. They're defining the Crusades differently. So after you have all these facts at your commands at what happened, who led it, who did what, then in your mind you're going to have to organize your thoughts and decide how you want to define what a crusade is. You see, because your guess is as good as anybody else's. I mean, of course, Jonathan Riley Smith spent 30 years writing about the Crusades, but when he started out, he started out in exactly your position in his first class, studying the Crusades and making up his mind what it was. And then, of course, he spent more years studying it. But and the same is true of Tyerman. I mean, they're all making up their minds what a crusade is from the facts at their command, and so you get to be historians and figure that out for yourself. Okay? Okay, any last thoughts before the red light comes on? Okay, well, I didn't get to St. Louis and I didn't get to the Fifth Crusade, but we'll take that up next time. We're going to have plenty of time, and next time we'll do those last great crusades, and we'll tie up all the loose ends for everybody in the next lecture. Okay? So see you next week. You have no reading assignment for next week because you're finishing up your research papers, right? Yay. Okay. We'll see you next week.